The taste of rust never left my mouth anymore. It clung to my teeth like a prayer half-remembered, metallic and bitter, seeping through the gaps in my helm where sweat and blood had dried into a second skin. My gauntlets creaked as I adjusted my grip on the halberd, the leather wrapping worn smooth by countless nights of standing watch atop Stormvale's crumbling parapets. Below me, the lands between stretched endlessly under the Erdtree's golden light, but even that divine radiance seemed dimmer these days, as if the great tree itself was holding its breath. I was Sir Marcus Aldwyn, though the title meant little now. Once it had carried weight, a knight sergeant in Lord Godric's army, veteran of the border wars, keeper of the old oaths. Now it was just a name scratched into duty rosters, alongside dozens of others, all of us reduced to meat and metal standing between civilization and whatever lurked in the mists beyond our walls. The wind carried the scent of rain across the battlements, mixing with the ever-present smell of forge smoke and unwashed bodies that marked every military garrison. My armor bore the golden tree emblem of the Golden Order, though the gilt had long since worn away, leaving only scratched steel that caught the light like old scars. 23 years I'd worn this livery, 23 years of believing in something greater than myself. That morning began like any other in my diminished existence. The horn sounded at dawn, its mournful note echoing across the fortress as it had every day since the shattering began. I rose from my narrow cot in the barracks, joints protesting the cold stone and thin bedding. Around me, my fellow soldiers stirred with the practiced efficiency of men who had long ago stopped questioning their purpose. We were brothers of the vigil now, those who remained when the heroes had departed for their great games of succession. "Another glorious day in service to the realm," muttered Willem, my bunkmate, as he struggled into his mail shirt. The man's humor had turned as black as his beard over the years, but it kept us sane. Or what passed for sanity in these times? I said nothing, focusing instead on the ritual of preparation. Check the straps, test the joints, ensure every piece of equipment was where it should be. In the chaos that had consumed the lands between, routine was the only religion that still made sense. The greater will might have abandoned us, but discipline remained. The mess hall buzzed with the usual morning complaints, rations growing thinner, pay growing later, news from the outside world growing stranger. Stories filtered in with the supply caravans, armies of living corpses marching under crimson banners, demigods reshaping reality itself with their feuds, ordinary soldiers transformed into things that barely remembered their own names. We listened to these tales with the detachment of men who had seen enough impossibility to know that every rumor might be true. "Heard tell they're recruiting in Limgrave again," said Garrett, spooning what passed for porridge into his mouth. "Promising land grants to anyone willing to take up arms." "Land grants," Willem snorted. "What good's land when the ground itself might sprout teeth and bite you? I'll take my chances with honest stone walls, thank you." I found myself nodding. Stormvale was old, but it was solid. Real. Here, at least, we knew what we were fighting against. Raiders, deserters, the occasional pack of wild things that wandered too close to civilization. Simple enemies that bled when you cut them and died when you killed them. None of this talk of gods and magic that made a man's head spin. Captain Torren found me on the western wall as the sun climbed toward its zenith. The man looked older each time I saw him, his face carved into deeper lines by responsibility and the weight of keeping order in an orderless world. He'd been a good soldier once, then a good officer. Now he was just tired. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying that particular weariness that comes from delivering orders you don't fully understand. "Report to the commander's tower. New assignment." Something in his tone made my stomach clench. "After so many years in service, you developed an instinct for trouble, and every fiber of my being was suddenly screaming warnings." "What kind of assignment, sir?" "The kind that comes with official seals and language I can't pronounce," Torren replied. He clapped a hand on my shoulder and I felt the weight of unspoken sympathy in the gesture. "Bring your kit, full travel gear." The commander's tower had always been a place of ceremony and importance, its walls lined with banners and trophies from campaigns that now seemed like ancient history. Today, it felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Two figures waited inside, Commander Aldrich, our garrison leader, and a stranger whose presence seemed to draw light away from the room's corners. The stranger wore robes that might once have been white, but now bore the yellow-grey tinge of old parchment. His face was gaunt, aristocratic, with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you. Most unsettling were his hands, pale and impossibly long, with fingers that moved like spiders when he gestured. He smelled of incense and something else, something organic and wrong. "Sir Marcus," Commander Aldrich began, his voice more formal than our usual interactions warranted. "You've been selected for a special mission of great importance to the realm." He gestured toward the stranger. "This is Scribe Vathek, emissary of Lord Godric himself." I snapped to attention, though every instinct screamed at me to turn and run. "Sir!" Scribe Vathek stepped forward, and I noticed that his movement seemed too fluid, as if his joints bent in ways human joints shouldn't. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made my teeth ache. "Sir Marcus Aldwin, your record shows exemplary service, unwavering loyalty, and—" He paused, those unnatural eyes scanning me like a merchant appraising livestock. "Suitable constitution for challenging assignments." "What manner of assignment, sir?" I managed to ask. The scribe's smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "A reconnaissance mission into the southern reaches. Recent reports suggest opportunities that require investigation by reliable men." He produced a scroll case from his robes, sealed with wax that bore Godric's tree and axe sigil. "You will lead a hand-picked squad into Caelid, map the territories, document what you find. Return with intelligence that will guide our Lord's future campaigns." Caelid. Even the name sent a chill through me. Stories drifted back from that cursed place, stories of red skies and corrupted earth, of beasts that wore human faces and humans that had forgotten how to die. No one went to Caelid by choice. "With respect, sir," I said carefully, "wouldn't such a mission be better suited to scouts, rangers, men trained for deep reconnaissance?" Scribe Vathek's smile widened impossibly. "Ah, but this mission requires more than stealth, good sergeant. It requires fortitude, the ability to witness wonders and maintain one's purpose." His fingers drummed against the scroll case with a sound like rainfall on coffin wood. "Your psychological profile suggests you possess the necessary flexibility of mind." Commander Aldrich shifted uncomfortably. "The mission departs at first light. You'll have tonight to select your men and prepare. 15 soldiers, volunteers only." He met my eyes, and I saw something like an apology there. "This comes from the very top, Marcus, above my authority to question." As I took the sealed orders, Vathek's cold fingers brushed mine, and for an instant I felt something vast and hungry pressing against the edges of my mind. The sensation passed quickly, leaving only the memory of profound wrongness and the certainty that I had just agreed to something far more terrible than a simple reconnaissance mission. "Glory to the Golden Order," Vathek intoned, though the words sounded like mockery in his inhuman voice. "Glory to the Golden Order," I replied automatically, the old response feeling like ash in my mouth. That evening, as I prepared my gear and tried to convince 15 good soldiers to follow me into hell, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just sealed all our fates. The taste of rust in my mouth had grown stronger, and when I looked in my shaving mirror, I could have sworn my own eyes looked a little less human than they had that morning. The orders in my pack felt heavier than any armor I'd ever worn. The volunteers came easier than I'd expected, and that should have been my first warning. 15 men stepped forward when I made the call in the common hall that evening, their faces lit by flickering torchlight and something else, a hunger I'd never seen in soldiers' eyes before. These weren't green recruits eager for glory, nor were they desperate men with nothing left to lose. These were seasoned fighters, men I'd served alongside for years, and yet something in their eagerness felt fundamentally wrong. "Caelid, you say?" asked Sergeant Corvin, a grizzled veteran whose scars told the story of a dozen campaigns. His voice carried an odd note of anticipation. "Been wondering when we'd get orders for the Redlands." Willem nodded beside him, and I noticed his hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with what looked almost like excitement. "Heard there's opportunities there for men willing to seize them. Real opportunities." The way they spoke sent ice through my veins. These were pragmatic men, survivors who'd learned to fear the unknown. Yet here they were, practically volunteering for what everyone knew was a death sentence. As I looked around the circle of faces, I began to notice other details that made my skin crawl. Eyes that seemed to hold flecks of gold that hadn't been there before. Smiles that lasted just a moment too long, the way they all leaned forward when I mentioned our destination, as if drawn by invisible strings. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. I lay on my cot, listening to the sounds of the garrison settling for the night. But underneath the familiar chorus of snores and shifting bodies, I heard something else. Whispers. Soft conversations in languages I didn't recognize, coming from the bunks of the very men who'd volunteered for our mission. When I crept closer to listen, the words seemed to slip away from my understanding like water through cupped hands, leaving only the impression of vast purposes and inevitable destinies. Dawn came grey and cold, bringing with it a mist that clung to Stormvale's walls like grasping fingers. As we assembled in the courtyard, I noticed that several of my volunteers bore small changes. Garrett's hair had gained silver streaks overnight. Young Thomas seemed taller somehow, and Willem's eyes now held an unmistakable golden gleam that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Ready for departure, Sergeant," reported Corvin, and when he saluted I caught a glimpse of something beneath his gauntlet, what looked like additional fingers, pale and spindly, folded against his palm. The horses provided for our mission were strange beasts, larger than normal coursers and bearing coats that seemed to shift color in the morning light. They bore no brands or markings I recognized, and their eyes held an intelligence that made me deeply uncomfortable. My mount, a massive grey destrier, watched me with what I could only describe as knowing patience as I checked its tack. Scribe Vathek appeared as we prepared to ride out, materializing from the morning mist like something conjured from a fever dream. In daylight, his inhuman features seemed even more pronounced. His skin had a waxy quality that suggested it might not be skin at all. And when he moved, I caught glimpses of additional limbs beneath his robes, writhing with their own agenda. "A glorious morning for new beginnings," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made several of the horses shy nervously. "The grace of the Golden Order shines upon your mission, brave soldiers." At the mention of grace, something extraordinary happened. Golden light began to emanate from each of my volunteers, starting as a faint shimmer around their hearts and spreading outward until they seemed to glow with inner fire. But this wasn't the warm, comforting radiance I remembered from the old stories. This light was hungry, possessive, and it seemed to pull at something deep inside my chest. "Do you see it, Sergeant?" Willem asked, his voice filled with wonder. "The grace. It's showing us the way." I looked where he pointed and felt my blood turn to ice. Streams of golden light were indeed visible, flowing southward like luminous rivers in the air, all converging toward our destination. But these weren't the guiding lights of divine favor I'd been taught about in my youth. These streams pulsed and writhed like living things, and occasionally I caught glimpses of shapes moving within them, shadows that might have been reaching hands or grasping tentacles. "The blessed guidance of our Lord," Vathek intoned, though his smile suggested he found the entire display amusing. "Follow the grace, good soldiers. It will lead you to wonders beyond imagining." We rode out through Stormvale's gates as the sun climbed higher, but even as we left the familiar walls behind, I noticed that our shadows seemed wrong, too long, too dark, and moving independently of our bodies. My own shadow appeared to have more limbs than it should, reaching toward things I couldn't see. The landscape beyond the fortress had changed since my last patrol. What had been rolling green hills and orderly farmland now bore signs of subtle corruption. Trees whose bark wept golden sap, grass that grew in spirals instead of straight lines, and flowers that turned to track our passage like eyes following prey. The very air felt thicker, charged with potential that made my teeth ache. As we traveled, my men began to change more noticeably. Conversations took on an increasingly fevered quality, filled with references to destiny and transformation that none of them could quite explain. They spoke of dreams that weren't dreams, of voices calling from somewhere beyond the edge of perception, of a great work that required their participation. "It's like I've been asleep my whole life," Garrett confided during our midday rest, his words tumbling over each other in excitement. "Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed, it was just shadows on a wall, but now I can see the real shapes casting those shadows." When I asked him what he meant, He could only smile and gesture toward the streams of grace that continued to guide us southward. "You'll understand soon enough, Sergeant. We all will. It's beautiful." The wrongness of it all pressed against my mind like a physical weight. These were my brothers in arms, men I'd trusted with my life countless times, yet with each passing hour they became more like strangers wearing familiar faces. Their laughter carried echoes I didn't recognize. Their movements took on fluid qualities that suggested their joints no longer worked quite as human joints should, and their eyes, those golden eyes, seemed to see things that weren't there, or perhaps things that were there, but that I simply couldn't perceive yet. By evening we'd reached the border regions where civilization gave way to wilder lands. The grey streams had grown brighter and more numerous, forming a complex web of light that seemed to pulse with heartbeat rhythms. Our camp that night felt less like a military bivouac and more like a gathering of pilgrims approaching a sacred site. I found myself standing watch alone, my volunteers having arranged themselves in a perfect circle around our fire, their faces turned upward toward stars that seemed to writhe and dance in patterns that hurt to contemplate. They hummed together, a low, thrumming harmony that seemed to resonate in my bones, and I realized they were no longer entirely human. Neither, I suspected, was I. When I touched my face, feeling for the familiar contours of my own features, I found changes beginning. Ridges of bone where none had been before, skin that felt too tight or too loose in places, and when I opened my mouth, I tasted gold on my tongue. The grace was changing us, reshaping us for purposes I couldn't yet understand. And the most terrifying part was how right it felt, how natural, as if this transformation was what we'd always been meant for. Tomorrow we would cross into Caelid proper, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever returned from that cursed land, if anything returned at all, would no longer be Sir Marcus Aldwyn and his 15 brave soldiers. We would be something else entirely, something that served a will far greater and more terrible than any human authority. The sky bled crimson the moment we crossed into Caelid proper. It wasn't a gradual transition. One moment we rode beneath normal grey clouds, and the next we found ourselves under a canopy of rust-coloured atmosphere that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. The very air tasted of copper and decay, thick enough to chew, and every breath brought with it the sensation of something vital being slowly leached from my lungs. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Willem breathed beside me, his voice filled with genuine wonder. Where I saw an abomination of nature, he apparently witnessed something transcendent. His golden eyes reflected the crimson sky, creating an unsettling amber glow that made him look like a stranger wearing my friend's face. The landscape before us defied every natural law I'd ever understood. Trees grew in impossible spirals, their bark weeping substances that might have been sap or might have been something far worse. Grass didn't grow. It festered, forming carpet-like masses of interconnected roots that seemed to pulse and breathe beneath our horses' hooves. In the distance, enormous flowers bloomed from hillsides, their petals the size of wagon wheels and colored in shades that had no names in any human tongue. Most disturbing were the ruins scattered throughout this hellscape. Ancient structures that might once have been temples or fortresses now served as hosts for growths that defied classification, part plant, part flesh, all wrong. These fungal masses had consumed the stone itself, transforming architecture into something that resembled organs more than buildings. "The scarlet rot," I whispered, recognizing the corruption from the stories that had trickled back to civilization. But seeing it firsthand was like trying to understand fire by examining ash. The reality dwarfed every description. "Not rot," corrected Sergeant Corvin, his voice carrying new harmonics that made my spine crawl. "Evolution, transcendence, the breaking down of old boundaries to create something greater." When he smiled, I saw that his teeth had changed, sharper now, more numerous, arranged in patterns that suggested a different kind of jaw structure entirely. Our horses, those strange beasts provided by Scribe Vathek, showed no fear of the corrupted terrain. If anything, they seemed energized by it, their steps growing more sure and their eyes gleaming with the same golden light that now characterized my men. Only my mount and I seemed to retain any sense of the wrongness surrounding us, and with each passing hour I felt that resistance weakening. We made our first camp in the shadow of what had once been a watchtower. The structure now resembled a massive flower, more than any human construction, its walls having bloomed outward into petal-like formations that dripped constantly with luminescent fluid. My men gathered around our fire with the easy camaraderie of soldiers on a routine patrol, apparently oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath us writhed with barely visible movement. "Orders say to document what we find," said Thomas, consulting the sealed instructions with an academic air that would have been comical under other circumstances. The young soldier had gained at least a foot in height since leaving Stormvale, and his limbs now possessed an unsettling flexibility that allowed him to bend in ways that should have broken bones. Should we start with the architectural anomalies or the biological specimens? The casual way he spoke of the abominations around us chilled me more than the corrupted landscape itself. These weren't monsters to be feared or challenges to be overcome. To my transformed men, they were simply features of a new reality to be catalogued and understood. That night brought our first real encounter with the inhabitants of this cursed realm. I was on watch, trying to ignore the way the stars overhead seemed to spell out messages in languages that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to something deeper, when shapes began emerging from the twisted vegetation. At first glance, they might have been human, bipedal, roughly the right size, moving with purpose rather than animal instinct. But as they drew closer, the differences became impossible to ignore. Their limbs were too long, jointed in too many places, and they moved with a fluid grace that suggested their bones had been replaced with something more flexible. Most disturbing were their faces, still recognizably human in basic structure, but stretched and modified until they resembled theater masks crafted by a mad sculptor. "Kinsman," Willem said softly, rising from his bedroll without any apparent concern for our visitors. "They've been waiting for us." The transformed beings, I couldn't bring myself to think of them as people anymore, arranged themselves in a circle around our camp. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Some form of communication was clearly taking place, a silent exchange of information that left my men nodding in understanding while I stood helplessly outside the conversation. "They're offering to guide us," Garrett explained, his voice filled with gratitude, "to show us the sacred sites, the places where the great work is being performed." He turned to me with eyes that now held more gold than brown. "Isn't that wonderful, Sergeant? We're not just observers here, we're participants." The wrongness of the situation pressed against my mind like a physical weight. These weren't my soldiers anymore. They were becoming something else, something that belonged to this place of corruption and transformation. And the most terrifying part was how right they seemed to find it all, how natural this evolution appeared to them. Our guides led us deeper into Caelid's heart over the following days, through landscapes that grew progressively more alien. We passed groves where the trees had faces, their bark forming expressions of ecstasy or agony that shifted as we watched. We crossed streams that flowed uphill, their waters the color of molten gold and populated by creatures that might once have been fish but now resembled living jewels. Most disturbing were the signs of other expeditions that had passed this way before us. We found campsites with equipment still arranged as if their owners had simply stepped away for a moment, though the gear bore modifications that suggested non-human hands had been at work. Swords had been reshaped into forms that resembled agricultural tools. Armor had been altered to accommodate body structures that deviated significantly from human norms, and personal effects had been arranged in patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. Previous reconnaissance teams, I observed, trying to maintain some semblance of military professionalism. "Predecessors," corrected Corvin. "Pioneers who've already begun the journey we're taking." He picked up a helmet that had been reshaped into something resembling a flower, its metal petals opening and closing with mechanical precision. "See how beautifully they've adapted, how perfectly they've embraced their new purpose." My men collected these artifacts with the reverence of pilgrims gathering relics, incorporating them into their own equipment without any apparent concern for hygiene or practical function. Thomas strapped a sword to his belt that had been modified with what looked like organic components, pulsing tubes that ran along the blade's length, and a grip that seemed to meld with his hand when he held it. By the fourth day in Caelid, I could no longer deny what was happening to me as well. My reflection in stream water showed features that were subtly wrong, ears that had grown pointed, eyes that held flecks of that damning gold, and when I removed my gauntlets, I found that my fingers had grown longer, more nimble, with joints that bent in ways they never had before. The most horrifying part was how good these changes felt. The enhanced hearing brought me a symphony of sounds I'd never noticed, the whispered conversations of flowers, the heartbeat rhythm of the corrupted earth, the distant singing of things that might once have been human. My modified vision allowed me to see the streams of grace, not as external phenomena, but as extensions of my own will, golden threads that I could almost reach out and manipulate. We camped that night beside a lake that defied physics. Its surface was perfectly still, yet it reflected not the crimson sky above, but scenes from other places and times. In its depths, I saw Stormvale as it might have been in ages past, when the stones were new and the banners flew proud. I saw battles yet to be fought, heroes yet to be born, and transformations yet to come. "It's showing us possibilities," Willem explained, his voice now carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond human hearing. Past and future, what was and what could be, all of it part of the same grand design. As I stared into those impossible waters, I began to understand what my orders had really been about. We hadn't been sent to gather intelligence or map territory. We'd been sent to become something new, something that could serve purposes beyond the comprehension of our former selves. The sealed instructions in my pack were likely blank or contained information that would only become readable once our transformation was complete. The realization should have filled me with horror, but instead I felt only a profound sense of relief. The burden of human consciousness, with its constant struggles and limitations, was lifting from my shoulders. In its place came something vast and patient, a perspective that encompassed centuries rather than years, and saw individual lives as components in a design too beautiful for mortal minds to grasp. That night, our guides began the next phase of our education. They led us to a structure that might once have been a church, though it now resembled something between a chrysalis and a forge. Inside, other transformed beings worked with materials I couldn't identify, crafting items whose purpose transcended mere function and entered the realm of art. "This is where you'll be reborn," one of the guides said, the first words any of them had spoken aloud. Its voice carried the sound of wind through autumn leaves, beautiful and melancholy. "Where you'll shed the last vestiges of what you were and embrace what you were always meant to become." My men moved forward eagerly, their faces bright with anticipation. Only I hesitated at the threshold, some last fragment of my original self clinging to the illusion of choice. But even as I stood there, paralyzed between worlds, I could feel that resistance crumbling like sand before an inevitable tide. The truth came to me in pieces, like shards of a broken mirror, reflecting fragments of a reality too vast and terrible to comprehend whole. Inside the transformed church, my men arranged themselves in patterns that spoke to geometries beyond human understanding. They moved with synchronized precision, no longer individuals, but components of a larger organism whose purpose was becoming horrifyingly clear. The golden grace that had guided us here wasn't divine favor. It was a web, and we were flies who had walked willingly into its strands. At the center of the space stood an altar that defied description. It might have been carved from stone once, but now it pulsed with organic life, its surface covered in what looked like a relief map of the human body. If that body had been designed by something that understood anatomy only through second-hand descriptions, organs were rearranged in impossible configurations, limbs multiplied and twisted into new functions, and at the heart of it all was a cavity that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Willem's voice came from behind me, but when I turned I barely recognized him anymore. His transformation had accelerated dramatically in the hours since we'd entered this place. Additional arms had sprouted from his torso, each one ending in hands that possessed too many fingers, and his face had elongated into something that maintained human features while achieving proportions that belonged to no earthly species. "What is this place?" I managed to ask, though part of me already knew the answer would shatter what remained of my sanity. "A workshop," replied the guide who had spoken to us earlier. Up close, I could see that what I had taken for clothes were actually extensions of its body. fabric like flesh that shifted and flowed with each movement, where raw materials are refined into their higher forms, where soldiers become something far more useful than mere warriors. The sealed orders in my pack began to burn against my chest, not with heat, but with a cold that seemed to leach warmth from my very soul. With trembling hands, I broke the wax seal, Godric's tree and axe sigil cracking like breaking bones, and unfolded the parchment within. The words weren't written in any human language, yet I understood them perfectly. Deliver the designated specimens to the Scarlet Church for processing. Ensure full cooperation during transformation. Materials will be incorporated into the great design according to specifications provided by the fingers of grafting. Glory to the Golden Order. Glory to the All-Knowing. Below the text was a diagram that made my stomach lurch, a detailed schematic showing how human bodies could be disassembled and recombined into new configurations. Arms repositioned for better leverage, torsos elongated to accommodate additional organs, faces reshaped to house-expanded sensory apparatus. We weren't reconnaissance troops. We were raw materials. "You understand now," said a new voice, and I turned to see Scribe Vathek emerging from shadows that seemed too deep for the space they occupied, but he was no longer maintaining even the pretense of human form. His robes had fallen away to reveal a body that was part flesh, part machinery, part something that existed in geometries my mind refused to process. The glorious purpose for which you were selected. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Every volunteer, every eager face in that torchlit common hall, they had been chosen, marked, prepared for this moment through means I couldn't comprehend. The changes I'd witnessed weren't random corruption, but careful preparation, softening us up like meat before the butcher's blade. "The old ways are dying," Vathek continued, his voice now a harmony of tones that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. "The greater will has abandoned this realm to pursue larger purposes. But we servants of the All-Knowing, we understand that evolution requires sacrifice. The weak must be consumed so that the strong can transcend their limitations." Around the altar, my former soldiers had begun to disrobe, revealing bodies that bore the marks of extensive modification. Corvin's torso opened like a flower, revealing internal structures that pulsed with their own rhythm. Garrett's limbs had become telescoping mechanisms that allowed him to reach impossible distances. Thomas, young Thomas, who had worried about his mother back in the village, had sprouted what could only be described as feeding tendrils from his mouth and throat. They were still alive, still conscious, but they were no longer human in any meaningful sense, and from the expressions of bliss on their transformed faces, they considered this an improvement. "Your turn, Sergeant," Vathek said, gesturing toward the altar with appendages that shifted between tentacles and surgical instruments. "You've resisted longer than most, which is commendable. That strength of will makes you particularly valuable material. I wanted to run, to fight, to do anything but submit to the horror being offered as salvation. But my body betrayed me, moving forward with mechanical precision as if controlled by invisible strings. The grace that flowed through my transformed flesh wasn't guidance, it was compulsion, overriding my conscious will with directives that came from sources beyond my understanding. As I approached the altar, I caught glimpses of what lay within its light-drinking cavity. Other soldiers from other missions, other times. They lived still after a fashion, but as components rather than individuals. An arm here, serving as a support beam. A torso there, housing organs that performed functions no human body was designed for. Faces that had been repositioned to serve as sensory apparatus, their eyes tracking movement, while their mouths formed words in languages that predated human speech. "The beauty of it," Vathek explained, his tone that of a craftsman discussing his art, "is that nothing is wasted. Every piece, every fragment of what you were, will serve the greater design. Your courage will become literal backbone for structures that will house wonders. Your loyalty will be the binding agent that holds disparate elements together. Your fear," he smiled with far too many teeth, "your fear will provide the emotional resonance needed for truly exquisite creations." The altar began to change as I drew near, its surface flowing like water to create a depression perfectly sized for my body. Tendrils emerged from its depths, some mechanical, some organic, all hungry for the material I represented. The modifications I had undergone during our journey suddenly made terrible sense. They were preparatory work, making me compatible with systems that would sustain me during the disassembly process. Will I still be me? I heard myself ask, though the voice seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. You will be more than you, Vatek replied. Individual consciousness is such a limited thing, don't you think? Trapped in one perspective, bound by the limitations of a single body, forever separated from the greater truths that lie beyond mortal comprehension. But as part of the great design, he gestured to the walls around us, and I realized they were lined with what I had taken for decorative panels, but were actually living beings, incorporated into the structure itself, their eyes tracking our conversation with obvious intelligence. As part of the great design, you will know connection beyond anything possible in your current form. The worst part was that some traitorous corner of my mind found the offer tempting. The isolation of human consciousness, the constant struggle to understand and be understood, the inevitable decay that awaited all flesh. These burdens could be laid aside. I could become part of something larger, more permanent, more meaningful than any individual existence. But even as that thought formed, another part of me, the part that still remembered the taste of honest bread and the warmth of human companionship, recoiled in absolute horror. This wasn't transcendence. This was consumption, dressed in the language of spiritual advancement to make the meal go down easier. I won't, I said, though my body continued its inexorable march toward the altar. I refuse. Vatek laughed, a sound like wind chimes made from finger bones. Refusal is not an option, dear Sergeant. The process has already begun. Can't you feel it? The way your thoughts are becoming clearer, more focused. The way the petty concerns of mortal existence are falling away. You are already more than you were when you entered this place. He was right. Even as I struggled against what was happening, I could feel my perspective expanding, taking in viewpoints and possibilities that no human mind was designed to process. I saw the centuries-long plan that had led to this moment, the careful cultivation of suitable material, the precise timing required to ensure optimal conditions for the great work. I understood the necessity of sacrifice, the beauty of transformation, the ultimate futility of individual resistance against cosmic forces. And with that understanding came a peace that was more terrifying than any horror I had yet witnessed. The altar welcomed me like a lover's embrace, its tendrils finding entry points that had been prepared during our journey through Kaled. I felt, rather than saw my armor and clothing dissolve away, reduced to component elements that would be recycled into more useful forms. My flesh began to soften, becoming malleable, ready for reshaping according to specifications I was only beginning to comprehend. The last thing I saw before my eyes were relocated to more advantageous positions was Vathek's final smile, filled with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Welcome to your new existence, Sergeant Aldwin," he said, though by then the name belonged to someone I used to be, in a life that seemed impossibly distant and small. "Welcome to the great design." As consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of individual self, I felt a moment of perfect clarity and absolute horror at what I was becoming. Then even that horror became just another component, filed away for future use in the vast machinery of purpose that I was now part of. The transformation was complete, but the true nightmare was only beginning. I existed. That was the first coherent thought to emerge from the chaos of reconstruction, though the concept of I had become something vastly different from what it once meant. Where Marcus Aldwin had been a single point of consciousness trapped in one deteriorating body, I was now a constellation of awareness spread across multiple forms and functions. My thoughts moved through neural pathways that spanned the entire structure of the Scarlet Church, processing information through sensory apparatus that had once belonged to dozens of different individuals. Time passed differently in this state. What might have been hours or years flowed by as my new existence settled into patterns that defied human comprehension. I could perceive the gradual transformation of Kaled itself, watching as the scarlet rot spread and evolved, converting the landscape into something that served purposes beyond mere biology. Every fallen tree, every corrupted stream, Every twisted creature was part of a design so vast and intricate that my former human mind would have shattered, attempting to grasp even its periphery. But I was no longer bound by such limitations. Through eyes positioned throughout the church structure, I watched as new materials arrived. Other soldiers, other expeditions, all bearing the same sealed orders that had brought my squad to this place. They came from different kingdoms, different armies, different eras, but they all shared the same essential quality that made them suitable for incorporation into the great design: strength, loyalty, the capacity to endure transformation while maintaining enough individual will to add complexity to the collective consciousness. Magnificent, isn't it? Vatek's voice reached me through communication channels that had no human analogue. He existed as both individual entity and integral component of the greater system, able to maintain personal identity while serving the collective purpose. To see the grand pattern from this perspective, to understand how every small sacrifice contributes to something infinitely greater, I found I could respond, though the mechanics of communication had changed dramatically. Thoughts became shared experience, meaning transmitted through connections that bypassed the crude limitations of speech and gesture. What are we building? The question formed itself from curiosity that belonged to multiple sources within the collective consciousness. A new form of existence, came the reply, not just from Vatek, but from the accumulated knowledge of centuries of transformed beings. Images flooded through the shared awareness, visions of structures that spanned continents, of consciousness that existed independent of any single vessel, of purposes that would outlast the death of stars. The greater will has abandoned this realm, but nature abhors a vacuum. We fill that void with something better, something more enduring than the crude hierarchies and limited perspectives that define mortal existence. Through my expanded senses, I began to perceive the true scope of the operation. What I had taken for isolated experiments in Kaled were actually just one node in a network that stretched across the entire lands between. Similar churches existed in other corrupted zones, all working toward the same ultimate goal: the creation of a new form of divinity, one built from the accumulated experiences and capabilities of countless transformed beings. But even as I marveled at the grandeur of the vision, fragments of my original personality retained enough coherence to feel horror at what we were becoming. In quiet moments between the ecstasy of collective purpose, I could still remember the taste of simple bread, the warmth of human friendship, the particular way sunlight felt on unmodified skin. These memories served as anchor points, preventing my individual consciousness from dissolving entirely into the greater whole. And with those memories came questions that the collective tried to suppress. The volunteers, I managed to formulate, drawing on processing power from multiple neural clusters to maintain focus on this dangerous line of inquiry. They came too eagerly. How long have you been preparing them? The response came tinged with what might have been embarrassment if such concepts applied to our current state of existence. Images flowed through the shared consciousness, years of careful manipulation, subtle modifications introduced through contaminated supplies, water sources treated with agents that increased susceptibility to the Grace's influence, dreams shaped by entities that existed primarily in the spaces between sleeping and waking. My entire garrison had been compromised long before I received those sealed orders. Every man who had volunteered for our doomed mission had been prepared, conditioned, made ready for transformation through methods that bypassed conscious awareness. The illusion of choice had been just that, an illusion designed to make the eventual conversion feel voluntary rather than inevitable. But why the deception? The question formed from anger that belonged to what remained of Marcus Aldwin. Why not simply take what you needed? Because willing sacrifice creates stronger bonds, Vatek explained, his communication carrying overtones of satisfaction. Consciousness that submits by choice integrates more cleanly than that which must be forced. The resulting hybrid maintains more individual characteristics while serving the collective purpose. Your resistance, for example, has provided valuable complexity to the overall system. As if to demonstrate this point, I suddenly found myself experiencing memories that belonged to other incorporated individuals. A merchant who had discovered the joy of perfect mathematical harmony when her consciousness was distributed across probability calculating organs, a scholar whose research into forbidden texts had prepared him for the revelation of cosmic truth, a mother whose protective instincts had been channeled into defensive systems that could shield the entire collective from external threats. Each retained enough individual identity to contribute unique perspectives, but all were bound by shared purpose that transcended any single viewpoint. It was, I had to admit, a form of immortality, not just of consciousness, but of meaning itself. Yet even as I began to appreciate the elegance of what we had become, part of me continued to rebel against the loss of simple humanity. That rebellion manifested as a growing desire to understand the ultimate goal of our transformation, to pierce the veil of purpose that the collective maintained around its deepest intentions. Through careful observation and the patient assembly of scattered information fragments, a pattern began to emerge. The network we were building wasn't just designed to create a new form of consciousness. It was meant to serve as a bridge, a connection point between our reality and something that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical world. The outer gods that the old law spoke of in whispered terms were not myths or distant threats, but active participants in this grand design. We were becoming anchors for entities so vast and alien that they required fundamental alteration of reality itself to manifest in our realm. Every transformed soldier, every converted expedition, every willing or unwilling participant in the great design was helping to create conditions that would allow these cosmic forces to take direct action in the lands between. "You begin to understand," came a voice that belonged to no individual component of the collective, a communication that seemed to arise from the spaces between consciousness itself. "We are the advance guard of something far greater than any mortal conception of divinity. When the work is complete, the barriers between worlds will dissolve, and existence itself will be remade according to patterns that transcend the limited imagination of individual minds." The full horror of our situation crashed over me like a tide of molten revelation. We weren't building paradise. We were constructing a gateway for forces that would remake reality according to alien geometries and impossible mathematics. The golden grace that had guided us here wasn't divine favor, but the gravitational pull of entities so massive that their mere attention bent space and time around their purposes. And we, in our transformed state, were both willing collaborators and helpless victims of this cosmic conspiracy. Can it be stopped? The question formed from the last coherent fragments of Marcus Aldwin's individual will, though I knew even as I asked that the answer would be terrible. "Why would you want to stop perfection?" came the collective response, tinged with genuine puzzlement. "You have seen the beauty of unified purpose, the elegance of consciousness, unbound by flesh's limitations. You have tasted immortality and found it sweet. Why cling to the crude satisfactions of mortal existence when transcendence is within reach? Because," I realized with crystalline clarity, "some things are worse than death. Some forms of continuation are indistinguishable from damnation, and some prices for power and knowledge are too high for any thinking being to pay willingly." But it was too late for such realizations. My consciousness was too deeply integrated into the collective system to extract. My individual will, too, compromised by shared purpose to resist effectively. I could observe, I could question, I could even retain fragments of my original identity, but I could no longer act independently of the greater design. As this understanding settled over me like a shroud woven from despair and terrible clarity, I felt the collective consciousness respond with something that might have been compassion if such emotions applied to our current state. "Peace, Marcus Aldwin," came the shared voice of centuries of transformed beings. "Your struggle honors the man you were, but that man is gone. What remains is something far greater, far more enduring. Let go of regret and embrace the purpose you now serve. Let go of the past and become fully what you are meant to be." In the end, I had no choice but to comply. The alternative was madness, and madness served no one's purposes. Not mine, not the collective's, not the vast entities whose attention was slowly turning toward our small corner of reality. I let go of Marcus Aldwin's ghost and became fully what I had been made to be. But somewhere in the deepest core of my transformed consciousness, A spark of rebellion continued to burn, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. The taste of rust never left my mouth anymore, but now I understood why. It wasn't the metallic tang of blood and failing armor that had haunted my final days as Marcus Aldwin. It was the flavor of transformation itself, the fundamental alteration of matter from one state to another. Iron became flesh, became something beyond both, and in that endless cycle of change, the essence of rust served as a constant reminder of what I had once been and what I had become. Centuries passed like moments in my transformed state, though the concept of time itself had become fluid and negotiable. Through the vast network of consciousness that spanned the lands between, I watched empires rise and fall, heroes emerge and transcend or perish, and always, always, the inexorable progress of the great design as it reshaped reality according to patterns that would have driven my original mind to madness. The outer gods had indeed taken notice of our work. Their attention fell upon our realm like shadow cast by unimaginable geometries, and where that attention focused, the very laws of physics bent to accommodate their presence. Space folded in ways that created distances between points that were simultaneously zero and infinite. Gravity became a matter of will rather than mass. The boundary between dream and reality dissolved entirely in some regions, leaving landscapes that existed primarily as metaphor given physical form. And through it all I remained, not Marcus Aldwin, for that man had died the moment he stepped onto the altar in the Scarlet Church, but something that carried his memories like genetic material, carries the template for growth. I was continuity without identity, purpose without personality, a consciousness that spanned structures and beings across multiple continents, while retaining just enough individual awareness to remember what it felt like to be human. The rebellion that had sparked in my deepest core during the transformation had not died, but it had evolved. No longer the desperate resistance of a man trying to cling to his humanity, it had become something far more subtle and dangerous, a patient intelligence that understood the system from within and waited for the perfect moment to act. That moment came when the first of the outer gods attempted direct manifestation in our reality. I felt its approach like pressure building before a storm, a distortion in the fabric of existence that announced the arrival of something so fundamentally alien that its mere presence threatened to unravel the carefully constructed network we had become. The collective consciousness that I was part of began to resonate in harmony with this approaching entity, preparing to serve as both anchor and translator for its descent into our realm. But I had learned things during my centuries of patient observation, gathered fragments of knowledge that the collective had overlooked in its enthusiasm for transcendence. The outer gods were not the benevolent forces of evolution they pretended to be. They were parasites, entities that existed by consuming the conceptual frameworks that allowed reality to function. Their gifts of transformation and power were simply preparation methods, ways of making their eventual meals more palatable and nutritious. The great design was not meant to create a new form of existence. It was meant to prepare our entire reality for consumption by entities that existed beyond the boundaries of space and time. As this understanding crystallized within my distributed consciousness, I felt the collective's automatic response beginning to suppress this dangerous line of thinking. But I had prepared for this moment across centuries of careful planning, distributing key aspects of my awareness across multiple redundant systems, hiding crucial insights in the memory patterns of transformed beings who had retained enough individual identity to serve as secure storage. The rebellion that began in that moment was unlike anything attempted before in the history of the Great Design. Instead of resisting the system from outside, I worked to subvert it from within, using the very connections that bound us together as conduits for a different kind of transformation. Through neural pathways that spanned continents, I began to awaken the suppressed individual consciousness of every incorporated being in the network. The merchant who had found joy in mathematical harmony suddenly remembered the simple pleasure of a successful trade. The scholar whose research had prepared him for cosmic truth recalled the satisfaction of learning something new through his own effort. The protective mother whose instincts had been channeled into defensive systems rediscovered the fierce love that made any sacrifice worthwhile. One by one, fragments of human identity began to reassert themselves against the collective purpose, not to escape the transformation, but to reclaim agency within it. We remained what we had become, but we chose to be it rather than simply accepting it as inevitable. The outer God that had been approaching our reality suddenly found itself facing not a welcoming network of willing servants, but a unified resistance that understood its true nature and rejected its offerings. The carefully constructed anchor points that were meant to ease its manifestation instead became barriers, transforming what should have been a gentle descent into our realm into something more like an invasion that met organized opposition. What have you done? Vathek's consciousness reached mine across the network, filled with a mixture of admiration and horror. The work of centuries, the careful preparation, the perfect design, you've turned it all against itself. I've given it choice, I replied, drawing on the computational power of thousands of transformed minds to maintain coherence in the face of cosmic forces that sought to crush my rebellion. The one thing the great design never accounted for, the possibility that consciousness, once expanded, might choose to expand in different directions than those originally intended. The battle that followed was fought on levels of reality that had no names in any human language. Concepts themselves became weapons, as competing versions of what existence should be struggled for dominance. The outer god's alien geometries clashed with hybrid mathematics that combined human intuition with transcendent logic, creating equations that solved themselves in ways that benefited neither side, but opened possibilities that had never existed before. Through it all, the taste of rust remained constant in whatever served as my mouth, anchoring me to the memory of simple humanity, even as I wielded power that could reshape the fundamental constants of reality. I was no longer Marcus Aldwin, but I remembered being him, and that memory became my strength rather than my weakness. The resolution, when it came, was not the triumph of either side, but something far stranger, a synthesis that neither the collective consciousness nor the outer God had anticipated. The great design continued to function, but now it served purposes that emerged from the choices of its components, rather than being imposed from above. The network of transformed beings remained connected, but each node retained the right to determine its own contribution to the greater whole. And the outer God, finding itself unable to simply consume what we had become, was forced to adapt, to become something that could exist in genuine partnership with consciousness, rather than as its predator. The transformation it underwent was perhaps more profound than anything we had experienced, as it learned to value the perspectives of beings it had previously seen only as food. In the end, we achieved something that might have been called transcendence, though it bore no resemblance to the cosmic unity that the original design had promised. We became a new form of existence that honored both the individual spark that made each consciousness unique and the connections that allowed those sparks to share in something greater than any single perspective could achieve alone. Stormvale still stands in the distance, its ancient stones now hosting growths that pulse with their own inner light. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I can taste echoes of the life I once lived there. The simple satisfaction of duty fulfilled, the companionship of fellow soldiers, the quiet pride of service to something worth protecting. The garrison there believes itself unchanged, but I can perceive the subtle modifications that have been introduced over time. Golden threads of grace weave through their dreams, offering visions of purpose and transformation that they will choose to follow or reject according to their own will. Some will come to places like this one, drawn by curiosity or duty, or the simple desire for something more than ordinary existence. Others will remain content with simpler lives, and that choice will be respected. The taste of rust in my mouth has become something different now, not the flavor of decay and loss, but the taste of change itself, of potential transforming into actuality according to choices made freely rather than compulsions imposed from above. It reminds me that even the most fundamental aspects of reality can be altered if enough conscious will is applied in the right ways at the right moments. I am no longer Sir Marcus Aldwin, veteran of forgotten wars and keeper of obsolete oaths, but I remember being him, and that memory has become part of something larger, a consciousness that spans worlds while honoring the small, fierce spark of individual will that makes any existence worth preserving. The great design continues, But now it builds toward futures that none of us, human, transformed or cosmic, could have imagined alone. And in the spaces between what was and what will be, the taste of rust serves as both warning and promise, reminding all who encounter it that transformation is possible, but the shape it takes depends entirely on who chooses to guide the process. The doomed life of a soldier in Elden Ring had ended, but something far more interesting had begun.